Hallo Deutschlerner. So one day a student of mine asked me a relatively mundane question in class. How do you make something plural in German? Can I just add an S like I do in English? You should have seen the look on his face whenever I told him that there are 9 different ways to change a noun from singular into plural listed in his textbook. And this wasn't even an exhaustive list. I probably scared that kid a little bit more than necessary, but the general premise is the same. There are nouns in German that simply add an S to the end of the noun and become the plural version. But others add E, some ER, others add an umlaut. So when do we decide which one to use and how? By the time that you finish this video right here, you will be an expert in the plural forms of German nouns, and you'll go from das kann ich nicht to das ist kein Problem in no time. In order to really understand the plural forms of nouns, I'm going to teach you several things. First of all, I'll lay the groundwork for how plurals act in the German language on a broad scale. Then I'll show you the most common ways that singular nouns are changed into the plural forms. Once we get through the common ones, I'll go even further down the list into the lesser used changes. In the end, I'll give you some tips and tricks that can help you to understand this entire system more easily and require only 10% of your brain, so you can use the rest of your brain capacity for storing pictures of birds with arms or something. Each German noun has, at the very least, a change in the article that is used in front of it. You are already familiar with articles that are commonly associated with masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns, so der, die, and das. The plural forms of German nouns require the article die when used as the subject or the direct object of the sentence. In other words, when it's used as the nominative case or the accusative case. The article changes to den in the dative case and der in the genitive case. But if you're just learning about plural nouns for the first time, this is really unlikely that you're actually going to come across anything other than die as the article for a plural noun. Most German plural nouns have both a singular and a plural version. For example, die Karte, or card or ticket, changes to die Karten, or cards or tickets. Der Hund for dog, singular form, changes to die Hunde for dogs in the plural. Some nouns are almost exclusively used in the singular form. For example, das Geld, money, der Käse, cheese, der Hunger, hunger, die Milch, milk, das Chaos, chaos. There is a plural form of das Geld, which is called die Gelder, which is monies, but this is a slightly different meaning than the singular form. You can say die Käse, which is cheeses, for the plural form of der Käse, but this is a pretty specific circumstance. Most people would probably use die Käsesorten, or types of cheese, instead. Some nouns only have a plural version. For example, die Eltern, which would be parents. Die Leute are people. Die Ferien is vacation or a break. To talk about one parent, you either need der Vater, father, or die Mutter, which is mother, or the word das Elternteil, which is a parental unit, which has always just sounded kind of odd to me. Before I get into the patterns that nouns follow when changing into the plural form, it's important to note that there aren't really any hard and fast rules. The patterns that I'm going to show you are exactly that. They're just patterns. They help you a lot when memorizing the plural forms of nouns because they work most of the time, but you're still going to have to learn them for each noun, just like you did for the genders of nouns. By the way, I just made a video about how to master der, die, and das with the least amount of effort possible, so you should check that out when you're done with this video. Pattern number 1. Unchanged forms. Some German nouns keep it simple. The noun itself does not change, but the article becomes die. This of course means that none of the feminine nouns are in this category, as the change would not be noticed. Examples include der Computer changing to die Computer, and das Mädchen changing to die Mädchen. While there are very few absolutes in the German language, you can be assured that any noun that ends with the diminutive endings chen or lein will have a plural form that does not change. Examples include das Mädchen, die Mädchen, as I already mentioned, das Männlein, die Männlein, das Bäumchen, and die Bäumchen. A slightly less reliable rule is that nouns that end with er usually do not change in the plural. For example, der Computer, die Computer, der Lehrer, die Lehrer, der Rechner, die Rechner, der Schüler, die Schüler. You can actually generalize this rule a bit more and say that masculine and neuter nouns that end with either el or er don't change in the plural form. Instead, they simply change the article. Der Onkel, die Onkel, der Löffel, die Löffel, der Würfel, die Würfel. There are a few quirks to add to this list. There are a few masculine nouns that add an umlaut in addition to changing the article to die. For example, der Apfel, die Äpfel, der Bruder, die Brüder, der Garten, die Gärten, der Laden, die Läden, der Schwager, die Schwäger, der Vater, die Vetter, der Vogel, die Vögel. While there are no feminine nouns in the strict no change category, there are a couple of them that only require the umlaut, namely die Mutter changing to die Mütter and die Tochter changing to die Töchter. These are the only two nouns that I've ever found that do this in the entire German language, however, so you can just memorize those two and move on. Pattern number 2, adding e. Here's a fun statistic. 80% of masculine nouns and 75% of neuter nouns will simply add an e to the end of the noun and change the article to die. In fact, if the noun ends with ling, ich, or ich, it will definitely use an e for the plural. Here are a few examples of that. Der Flüchtling, die Flüchtlinge, der Schmetterling, die Schmetterlinge, der Zwilling, die Zwillinge, der König, die Könige, der Käfig, die Käfige, der Sittich, die Sittiche, der Pfirsich, die Pfirsiche, der Teppich, die Teppiche. One little notable weirdness is when a word ends with nis, you have to add an e, but you also double the s at the end. For example, die Kenntnis, die Kenntnisse, das Geheimnis, die Geheimnisse. This ending isn't just used with these suffixes, however. I already mentioned that 80% of masculine nouns and 75% of neuter nouns use e for the ending. Here are some examples that don't end with the suffixes that I've already mentioned. Der Bleistift, die Bleistifte, das Spiel, die Spiele, der Freund, die Freunde, das Heft, die Hefte, das Problem, die Probleme, der Tag, die Tage, der Tisch, die Tische. Occasionally this ending is also used for nouns that have a flair for the dramatic, we'll say. They require an umlaut in addition to the e. For example, der Ball, die Bälle, der Hof, die Höfe, die Stadt, die Städte, der Stuhl, die Stühle. There are also a few nouns that add er instead of just e. These nouns will always have an umlaut in the plural form as well, and they will never be a feminine noun. For example, das Buch, die Bücher, das Fach, die Fächer, das Haus, die Häuser. Pattern number 3, adding n. The German language really likes adding n to stuff. That is incredibly apparent in the way that nouns become plural. There are 3 subcategories that all end up with the word still ending with n. The first is the easiest. Simply add n to the end of the noun and change the article to d. This generally happens with nouns that end in e, which coincidentally is also usually a feminine noun. Neither of those are hard rules, however, as nouns that end with e are not always feminine, and not all nouns that take n for the plural end with e. There are a bunch of nouns, however, that do follow this rule. For example, die Ecke, die Ecken, die Note, die Noten, die Pause, die Pausen, die Woche, die Wochen, die Schule, die Schulen, die Gitarre, die Gitarren, die Hausaufgabe, die Hausaufgaben, die Tasche, die Taschen, die Tante, die Tanten, die Woche, die Wochen. The only noun that requires an n in the plural but does not end with an e would be the word die Schwester, which becomes die Schwestern. If a noun is feminine but ends with a consonant, you will probably add en instead of just n. There are also a few masculine nouns that add en for the plural. Die Arbeit, die Arbeiten. Die Uhr, die Uhren. Die Tür, die Türen. Der Herr, die Herren. Some feminine nouns don't end with a consonant, but will still require en. For example, die Frau, die Frauen. When you start with a masculine version of something, usually an occupation or a nationality, and you want to make this into a feminine form, you usually just add in and then change that into a feminine version. For example, der Arzt, die Ärztin. Der Freund, die Freundin. Der Lehrer, die Lehrerin. All of those are just feminine versions of the masculine nouns. In order to make plural versions of these feminine nouns, we add nen. This is one of those rules that you can take to the bank. It will always work. If you have a feminine version of a noun that ends with in, add nen for the plural. For example, die Ärztin, die Ärztinnen, die Freundin, die Freundinnen, die Lehrerin, die Lehrerinnen. Pattern number 4. Cognates and words that end in o, a, or I. The last pattern that you can actually rely on is nouns that add s for the plural. These include lots of English words that have been borrowed into the German vocabulary, and almost every noun in the German language that ends with I, a, or o. For example, das Kino, die Kinos, das Auto, die Autos, der Radiergummi, die Radiergummis, der Cousin, die Cousins, der Krimi, die Kremis, die CD, die CDs. It's also the standard plural ending of abbreviations, such as LKWs, semi-trucks or lorries, PKWs, passenger vehicles, DVDs, DVDs, Navis, navigation systems, LCDs, LCDs, GBs, gigabytes. There are a few words that end with I, a, or o, but have been around in German for so long that they've developed their own legitimately German-sounding plural endings. There are some people who use an s at the end of these, such as die Pizza, die Pizzas, or you could use the Germanic ending die Pizzen. Das Konto can be either die Kontos or die Konten. Miscellaneous outliers. Technically speaking, there are other patterns in German plural forms. These usually are just words that are stolen from other languages and then a German ending was slapped on top of it. For example, das Museum becomes die Museen. Der Kaktus becomes die Kakteen. And my least favorite, das Konzertsaal becomes die Konzertsäle. These kinds of plural formations are so rare that it's just in your best interest to simply commit them to memory whenever you encounter them. Or just do like the Germans do and make up your own version that sounds vaguely Germanic. I found out while researching this video that some Germans use the plural version of cactus as die Kaktusse. If you're a super nerd like me, you might be bored enough to look at the actual list of these kinds of nouns that I found on Café Lingua's website, which is linked down in the description. If you want to practice what you learned in this video or any of the other videos on my channel, check out my Deutschlerner Club. I share extra materials there like worksheets, video scripts, and MP3 downloads for every lesson that I upload. There are also hundreds of other lessons already available there. Check out the link in the description and join today. If you aren't ready to join just yet, you can check out several of the lessons for free via that same link. I hope you found this explanation enlightening and definitely a better answer than I gave that kid back in my class way back when. Just remember that the plural forms require the article die unless you're using dative or genitive cases. Most of the nouns will either add e or n or some variation thereof. The other outliers can simply be learned when you learn the noun itself. Remember, practice makes perfect. Keep exploring and using these forms in your German language journey. Viel Erfolg, viel Glück, am wichtigsten aber viel Spaß. Tschüss!